Hello, everyone. So I just want to say welcome to this information webinar on the top public high schools in the Tri-Valley area. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you all for coming, and I hope that this information is valuable to you. Just a little introduction on myself. My name is Cade Postelnik, and I currently work at the Academy. And one of the things that we've been working on at the Academy, besides providing supplemental math classes and services to children in grades K through 8, is collecting research on schools, both public and private, in the Bay Area. We get our research from the information that the schools provide us, as well as databases and feedback from parents and students. This webinar should last about 35 to 40 minutes, and then afterwards we will have a Q&A session. However, if you do have a question on any slide or at any point during the webinar, just feel free to type a question into the chat box, the public chat box, so that everyone can see, and we'll make sure to get to a couple of them, as many as we can, at the end of the webinar. And just before we get started, if you haven't already, we do have a Facebook group called Bay Area Schools and Parents Discussion, where we provide routine information for things such as academic statistics, key characteristics, and more based for Bay Area public and private schools. So if you want to join that group, you can do so right now. I hope you had a chance to just scan the QR code before the webinar, but if you didn't, that's totally fine. We will have the QR code up during the Q&A session as well. But without further ado, let's get into our webinar. So kind of how this webinar is going to go is we're going to introduce each school individually and give a short introduction on some basic information about them, and then a key characteristic that kind of separates them from the rest, as well as information on their academics. And then after we're done covering each school individually, we're going to have some comparison statistics up, which will give you a good visual for each school and see how they compare in each category side by side. And then obviously we will have the Q&A session at the end. So for the schools that are going to be covered today, we have 5. We're just going to cover them in alphabetical order just to make it easy. It is Amador Valley, Dougherty Valley, Foothill, Irvington, and Mission San Jose. We had some other schools that we wanted to cover in the Tri-Valley area, such as Dublin and American High School, but we only had time to cover 5. And these are the 5 that we felt were the most well-rounded and provided some very interesting characteristics that will be very nice to talk about. However, if you do want us to cover a school like Dublin or American or any high school, any kind of public or private school in general, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school in the Bay Area, if there is enough support, we will definitely get to those. So yes, without further ado, let's get into our first information slide, which is rankings by Niche and US News. These are for just California, not the US. One key point here is when you look at both US News and Niche, one thing that US News tends to focus more on are hard numbers, such as the Ivy League UC admission rates and the SAT, ACT scores. While Niche tends to focus more on like overall school experience, this can be how many extracurriculars they have, how many clubs they have, and it can go down to the teacher to student ratio. Niche does tend to focus very heavily on the teacher to student ratio because they personally believe that the less amount of students in the class per teacher, the more personalized education that the students will receive. So they tend to focus on that very much. And then it can even go as far as like geographical location. How do they believe like the city or the area that that school is in? How much do they like it? So those are the things that they tend to focus more on, both Niche and US News. And then when you look at these, when you look at these 2 charts, you can see there's a couple discrepancies. As you can see, Mission San Jose was rated very highly by US News, rated at 5th in the state, but Niche rated it at 61, so 4th on the list of these 5. And then there's some other discrepancies as well. So for Amador Valley and Foothill, Niche tend to like those schools more at 26 and 30, and then US News rated it at 62 and 61. And for the second major point here is that Dougherty Valley did have the highest average ranking at 29.5. This was the one school that it seems that both US News and Niche did kind of rate about the same. So that's just some information to take in consideration regarding these 2 databases or just rankings. for your personal information and how you're going to decide which school is best for your child. But without further ado, let's get into our first school. So our first school that we're going to be talking about today is Amador Valley High School. I did talk with some parents before this webinar, and they are planning on moving to the Bay Area. So I did put the city up just in case they don't know exactly where Amador Valley is. It is located in Pleasanton. And so for a brief introduction on Amador Valley, one key point that separates them from the rest is that they are very successful at the USA JMO math competitions, and they do have a solid variety of AP course options. We'll be getting into the USA JMO part in the key characteristics slide. And then going through this more of the basic information, the teacher to student ratio is 1 to 24. Just for a reference, the California average is 1 to 23. And then 79% of their teachers have 3+ years of teaching experience. And the California average, just for your reference, is 88%. So for the teacher to student ratio, a little bit higher than the average. And then for the teaching experience, it's a little bit lower than the California average. And then rounding out our basic information, we have for extracurriculars, 70 clubs and 24 sports. And then for 2020 and 2019 admission rates for UC Berkeley and UCLA, there was a drop in both categories. It's definitely pretty common that schools did see a drop from 2019 to 2020 due to COVID-19. UC Berkeley's was a little bit more significant at about a 9% drop. It went from 26.29%, which is very high, to 17.49%. And then UCLA went down a little bit by about 4% from 12.5 to 8.5. So now we'll get a little bit more into the university enrollment numbers. Some of the schools that we're covering today were nice enough to show us a pie chart of exactly where each student went, like the percentage for UC, CSU, or private. However, some schools didn't. So instead, we're breaking down the enrollment numbers specifically for the UCs and also some notable universities. So for the 2020 UC enrollment numbers, there was a lot of popularity for UC Santa Cruz and Berkeley at 32 and 23 respectively. And there was also some decent interest in Davis at 17 students getting enrolled there. And then to round out those numbers, there were 7 for Los Angeles, 15 for San Diego and Santa Barbara, 4 for Irvine, and 5 for Riverside. And then no data on Merced. These numbers were pulled from the UC admissions database. There was no data on Merced, so it's either 0 or not reported. And then some other notable universities that students got admitted to from Amador Valley in 2020 and 2021 was Stanford, Cornell, NYU, UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, and Northeastern. So getting into Amador Valley's key characteristic, which is their USA JMO competition, recently Amador Valley students have seen a lot of success at the USA JMO, which stands for the United States of America Junior Math Olympiad competitions. This year, Amador had 6 students in this year's USA JMO qualifiers. For comparison, Dougherty Valley did have a good amount as well at 5. And then the other 3 schools that we're covering today, Mission San Jose, Foothill, and Irvington, all had 0. And then we threw Lynbrook in here as well. Lynbrook is a high school located in San Jose, and they're very well known for math competition success. They had 5 students for a similar competition, USA MO. But as you can see, for the USA JMO, Amador Valley even did better than a very good math competition school as Lynbrook. So we just wanted to kind of show that statistic for you. If I were to say anything about Amador Valley, is that recently it's been definitely a very good school for students who are interested in math or competing in math competitions. And lastly, for Amador Valley's academics, one key point is that despite the admission rates dropping last year for UC Berkeley and UCLA, Amador Valley did see their academic numbers for the ACT and the SAT increase. Their ACT score went up from 28.5 in 2019 to 31 in 2020, and then their SAT score went up from 1,285 to 1,360. And then, as I said before, they do have a wide variety of AP courses at 25. And then rounding out their academics, their National Merit Semifinalist, or NMSF, went down slightly from 35 to 27 in 2020 and 2021. And then for their AP tests, 94% received a 3 or higher, and 47% of students scored a 5. Now for the California Assessment of Student Performance, or the CAASP, 81% were college ready for English, which is very good, and then 70% were college ready for math. So that is all for Amador Valley High School. So let's move on to our second school now. And our second school is Dougherty Valley High School, which is located in San Ramon. And so for a brief introduction on Dougherty Valley, one key point for them is that they do have a vast amount of club choices for students. As you can see in the extracurricular section, they have over 150 clubs and then 22 sports. They also were the only school out of the 5 that we're talking about today that saw an increase in UCLA admission rates. As you can see, down here at the bottom for 2019, it was at 10.98, and then it went up by about a percentage to 11.74% in 2020. Rounding out their brief introduction and information, their teacher to student ratio is 1 to 25, and then 90% of teachers have a 3+ years of teaching experience. And then lastly, for UC Berkeley admission, it did go down a little bit, not as much as Amador, but about 5% from 23.44 to about 18%. Now, for this graph here, which is where do Dougherty Valley students go after graduation? As you can see, both UC and out-of-state universities do attract the most Dougherty Valley graduates. 29% of students from the class of 2021 did go to the University of California, universities, and then 28% did go to out-of-state schools. And then you can see here for that third category, was actually community colleges at 24%. Now, obviously, nothing wrong with going to a community college, it's just personal preference. When we did look into the database, there was about 14 to 15% of the students who chose a community college at Dougherty Valley High School. They went to Diablo Valley College, which was rated at 25th best community college in the state. So that is very nice. But it is a key point because when we get into our other school that showed a graph like this, it was definitely a lot lower. So just a key point to notice. And then 12% of the students from the class of 2021 went to ACSU. Now for Dougherty Valley's information on their clubs, on top of the standard popular clubs such as that are usually at most high schools in the Bay Area, such as American Red Cross, the National Honor Society, Mock Trial, Future Business Leaders of America, Math Olympiad, etc. Dougherty Valley definitely offers an abundance of unique and interesting clubs for students to participate in. Like I said, there's about 150 of them, so we can't talk about all of them today. So what I do have is a link right here to the whole list at www.dvhigh.net/student clubs. That will take you to Dougherty Valley's club page, and then right on the right-hand side, there will be a link to their Google Sheets page, which will show a detailed list of every club name, the teacher that runs it, the student officer, and then a brief description of the club. So here we have 3 clubs that we wanted to talk about today that we thought were very unique and helpful. So the first one is called Code for Fun. And essentially what this club is that it promotes the exploration of all things relating to coding and computer science. Projects are encouraged to be group-based and are encouraged to be presented to the rest of the club once completed. And prior experience in coding and computer science is not required, since there's definitely club officers and tutors to help members along the way. So essentially this club is meant to try and get students interested in computer science or coding, get their foot in the door, create it as like a hobby that's fun. It's definitely no pressure because it's not a class, it's not graded, and they hope to encourage this interest to have them pursue a career or a degree in coding/computer science. And they definitely have other a lot of other clubs that are similar to Code for Fun. So a couple other ones are Computer Science Club, C++ and Applications Club, and DV Hack Club. Now for our next club, it is called Future Medical Specialists. Now essentially what this club does is that it does bring in, they bring in medical specialists from fields such as pediatrics, cardiology, as well as pre-med and med students. They bring them in, and they essentially what they do is they will provide Dougherty Valley High School students in this club information and have them gain knowledge in the field of medicine and help them make connections early on. The club also offers volunteer opportunities around the Bay Area to allow students to gain hands-on experience. So one of the main goals for this club is to get students who are interested in the field of medicine or pre-med, med school, to get that hands-on experience very early before college so that they are ahead of their peer group and hopefully make some connections before college as well. And they also have a couple other clubs that are similar to this called the Medical Research Club, Neuroscience Club, and Future Physicians of America. Now, for our last club here that we're going to talk about that we thought was very interesting and helpful is called Stories Are Us. And essentially what this club does is that it collaborates with younger elementary school classes, and they create these storybooks based on the children in the elementary school's ideas. So the club members will essentially ask these younger students for their illustrative input, and then students will work to compile virtual storybooks that can be shared with the parents of these younger students. And it's great for high school students to gain volunteer hours and experience working with younger children. So I would say if your student has an interest in becoming like a teacher or a counselor or any kind of field that is involving working with children, this is a great club to get a good start on and gain some experience. So that's just a couple introduction on some of their clubs. And yes, we have that link there so that you can view the full list for yourself. Now, lastly, for Dougherty Valley High School's academics, one key point, like we said, what I'll say right now is that they do have a high percentage of students who are college ready in both English and math. When you look at their CASP, 96% were college ready for English, which is very, very, very high. And then 88% were college ready in math, which is still the highest out of the 5 that we're talking about today. So according to the CASP, the students who are going to this high school come out college ready for these 2 subjects. For another key point is that they did have the same exact number of national merit semifinalists from 2020 to 2021. It both sits at 40. And then for the rest of their academics, their ACT scores did go up by a little bit over 1 point from 29.75 to 31. And then their SAT score in 2020 was 1390. And then for AP tests, 85% were 3 or higher, and then 31% scored a 5. And then lastly, for their AP classes, same amount as Amador Valley, definitely a good amount at 35. So now that we're done talking about Dougherty Valley High School, let's move on to our third school. And our third school here is Foothill High School, which is located in Pleasanton. And for a brief introduction on Foothill High School, their key characteristic is that they do have an impressive DECA program. We'll get more into that in a couple of minutes. And then their UC Berkeley admission rates actually remain the same from 2019 to 2020, which is definitely something to note considering most schools did see a drop. Theirs actually maintained relatively the same. It was 20.41% in 2019, and then it was at 20.21% in 2020. So essentially the same percentage at 20. And then to round out their other information, their teacher to student ratio is 1 to 21. And then 88% of teachers had 3+ years of teaching experience, so right on the California average. And then for their extracurriculars, they had 65 clubs and 25 sports. And then for their UCLA admission rate, it dropped by about a percentage and a half from 15.29% to 13.64%. Now, for Foothill High School's university numbers, when you look at their 2020 UC enrollment, there's a lot of interest in both Berkeley and Davis, as 27 students enrolled to Berkeley, 24 to Davis, and then a decent amount of interest for UC Santa Barbara at 18, and then rounding out their other ones, 15 enrolled in Los Angeles, 13 San Diego, 8 for Irvine, 17 for Santa Cruz, 10 for Riverside, and then again, they had no data for Merced on the UC admissions website. And then other notable universities that students were admitted to in 2020 and 2021 were Cornell, MIT, Stanford, University of Pennsylvania, and University of Chicago. Now, for their key characteristic, which is their DECA program, we did talk about DECA a little bit in our previous webinar regarding Monte Vista's DECA program, but if you are new to this webinar and this is your first one, for those who are unfamiliar, DECA stands for Distributive Education Clubs of America, and they essentially work to promote emerging young leaders for business or in business-related fields such as marketing, finance, hospitality, and management, and they do this through having students find a topic in these fields, and then they present it in front of a live audience in a professional business related setting. And so for Foothill High School's DECA program, it was pretty good for over the last 20 years. However, in the last 10 years, Foothill's DECA program has taken a significant jump, and they have definitely improved their results at events and competitions. For instance, since then, they've had 5 first place finishes, 2 second place finishes, and several other third place finishes. And in addition, students who have participated at Foothill High's DECA program have also gone on to attend top universities for business, such as University of Pennsylvania, MIT, Berkeley, and many others. Those 3 schools are currently rated by US News as the 3 top business schools, and they definitely have students going to all 3 of them. Lastly, for Foothill High School's academics, the key point here is that they have a high percentage of students who are college ready in English at 85%. That is the second highest out of the bunch of these 5 schools. And then they have 69% math ready, 69% are college ready in math, which is a little bit lower. And then their ACT scores did see a noticeable improvement by over 2 points from 27.75 to 30. And then a third key characteristic here for their academics is that they do have a lower number of national merit semifinalists in comparison to the other 4 schools. In 2020, it was already a little bit lower at 24, and then in 2021, it dropped a little bit further to 16. But rounding out their other academics, their SAT scores were 1340 in 2020. And then for AP tests, 90% of students scored a 3 or higher, and then 37% scored a 5. And then for the CAS, or I already said the CASP, but for the AP classes, it is slightly lower than Amador Valley and Dougherty Valley. It is right at 24, so 1 less, still a good amount. So that concludes our portion on Foothill High School. Now we're going to move into our 4th school. And our 4th school is Irvington High School, which is located in Fremont. And so a brief introduction of Irvington, one key characteristic that separates them from the rest is that they have the highest UC Berkeley admission rate among the 5 schools, and it is actually the only one that actually went up by a decent amount. When you see down here at the bottom for the 2019 UC Berkeley admission rate, it was 22.94%, which is already pretty good, but then it jumped up to 25.4% in 2020. So it is definitely impressive, as it is a commonality for schools to have it decrease due to COVID-19. Irvington actually saw their rates increase, and we'll get more into that in a couple minutes. But rounding out their brief information, their teacher to student ratio is 1 to 22. And then they had 73% of their teachers have 3 or more years of teaching experience. And then for extracurriculars, they have 43 clubs and 21 sports. And then for their UCLA admission rate, it went down by about 1% from 10.83% to 7.78 in 2020. Now for Irvington High School's university numbers, as for their 2020 UC enrollment, as you can see, a lot of interest in UC Berkeley. When you look at the slide before, they had 63 students who were admitted to UC Berkeley, and then in the end, 47 of those students decided to enroll in UC Berkeley. So a lot of students going to that school, and there was definitely a lot of interest in UC San Diego as well, as 29 students were enrolled there in 2020. And then rounding out the other schools, 8 went to Los Angeles, 15 went to Santa Barbara, 20 went to Irvine, 17 went to Davis, 13 went to Riverside, and there was actually some data on Merced. We had 3. And then for other notable universities, for students for the class of 2020 and 2021, they had students going to Yale, Stanford, New York University or NYU, Cornell, and USC or University of Southern California. Now to talk more about Irvington's UCB numbers, because we did want to talk about this for a couple more minutes because it is definitely a key point. Since 2020, Irvington has risen to be one of the top Bay Area high schools in this category. When you compare Irvington's UC Berkeley numbers to other top Bay Area schools, none of these schools we're talking about in depth today, because we'll compare Irvington's to those other 4 schools in the statistical comparison slide. But we have 5 other schools here, 3 public high schools that were one of the top public high schools in the Bay Area. You had Saratoga High, which was rated 3rd by Niche, 20 by US News, Gun High, which was rated 2nd by Niche, and 21 by US News, and then Limbrook, which was rated 12 and 14 respectively. So very good high schools in the Bay Area. When you look at their UC Berkeley admission rates, they don't compare necessarily to Irvington's, as Irvington is up there at 25.4%. Saratoga's is 14.35. Gunn is 12.66. And then Lynbrook's is 8.84. Lynbrook was the highest in one of the highest in 2019 at almost 30%, but it did drop in 2020 down to 8%. And now Irvington has one of those top spots at 25% as their rates kept going up from 2019 to 2020. And then we actually threw in two of the top private schools in the Bay Area, because it is worth noting in 2020, 15.4% of Harker students went and got admitted to UC Berkeley, and then 25% of basis independent in Silicon Valley students were admitted to UC Berkeley. So as you can see, if you do have a student who is wanting to go to UC Berkeley, Irvington High School has definitely shown over the last couple of years that they have a high percentage of students who attend that school. Now for Irvington's academics, one key point is that there was a noticeable increase in their ACT scores from 2019 to 2020, went up by 2 points from 30 to 32. And there was a noticeable decrease in their national merit semifinalists from 2020 to 2021. It went down from 46 to 33. But rounding out their other academics, their SAT score was 1390 in 2020. And then for their AP tests, 92% scored a 3 or higher, and 47% scored a 5. And then for their CAASP, about the same, 75% were college ready in English and 73% were college ready in math. And now lastly, for their number of AP classes offered, it is 21. So that concludes Irvington High School. So now let's move into our last and final school. And our last and final school is Mission San Jose, which is also located in Fremont. So for a brief introduction of Mission San Jose, as for Irvington, they were very good at UC Berkeley admission. Mission San Jose has definitely been one of the top schools recently in the Bay Area for Ivy League admission. Their teacher to student ratio is currently 1 to 25, and they have 93% of their teachers who have 3 or more years of teaching experience, which is the highest of the 5. And then for extracurriculars, they have a decent amount as well, over 100, and then 21 sports. For their 2019 and 2020 admission rates for UC Berkeley and UCLA, there was a drop for each category. It went from, for UC Berkeley, it went from 22.33%, which is pretty good, down to 14.55%. And then UCLA went down by about 3.5% from 11.88% to 8.36. Looking at this graph, which is where do Mission San Jose students go after graduation? As you can see, even though there was a drop for UCLA and UC Berkeley admission rates, UC schools do remain the most popular choice at about 180 students choosing to go there in 2020. And then there's definitely a lot of other interest for out-of-state schools. About 110 or 120 students went there in 2020. And then for the other 3 categories, CSU, private California universities, and then community college, not as much interest, especially for the community college, at about 5%. Now for their key characteristic, which is the Ivy League number, in 2020, 16 students at Mission San Jose were admitted to Harvard, MIT, Stanford, and other prestigious private universities. We have an exact breakdown here. 1 student was admitted to Columbia, 1 student was admitted to Harvard. They had 5 to Cornell, which is very nice, 4 to MIT, 2 to Stanford, and 3 to the University of Pennsylvania. And down below, we have some data from the Polaris List database, which they essentially track the amount of students for each high school get into Harvard, Princeton, and MIT. This is their most recent one for 2018. Compared to the other 4 schools, Mission San Jose had 9 students get into Harvard, Princeton, or MIT, whereas Foothill had 3. Amador Valley and Irvington both had 2, and then Dougherty Valley had 1. So for the last couple of years, it is easy to say that Mission San Jose has definitely been a very successful school for Ivy League and other prestigious universities like Stanford to get into. So there's some information on their Ivy League numbers. Now we'll get into their academics. For one key point, they did have a high amount of SAT scores. High SAT score average, sorry, the highest of the bunch at 1450, in 2020, and they do have a strong number of national merit semifinalists as well. As in 2020, it was 57, which is already pretty high, and then it went up even more to 64 in 2022 or 2021. And then looking at their other numbers, they had 31 was their average ACT score in 2019. That went up by 2 to 33 in 2020. And there was even some info on their GPA breakdown. They had 5% of their students receive a 4.0 GPA, and then their most common category was 3.5 to 3.99 GPA at 55% of their students. For their AP test, they had 92% receive a 3 or higher, and then almost 50%, 49, receive a 5 on their AP tests. As for their CAASP, both were categories, English and math, were around 80%. And then for AP courses, they have 21. So that concludes the individual information on all 5 of our schools. So now we're going to spend a couple minutes to just go over some key statistical comparisons. So to start off these statistical comparisons, for UC Berkeley admission, you can see here that there definitely is the strongest one is Irvington at 25%, and it was already pretty good at 22%, but it was the only one to go up. And then Amador Valley, Dougherty Valley, and Mission San Jose saw decent decreases from 2019 to 2020, and then Foothill remained the same at 20%. Now for their UCLA admission, it's a bit of a different story. Dougherty Valley was the only school that saw a slight increase by about 1%. However, despite the decrease from about 15 to 12%, Foothills is still the highest as of 2020. Next, we'll just do a brief intro or info for their ACT scores. They did have an impressive increase across the board. As you can see, all 5 of the schools saw an increase from 2019 to 2020, which you'd love to see that. And Mission San Jose is slightly above the others at 33 in 2020, and then Irvington had 32 in 2020. But all the numbers very close together. For their SAT scores, you can see they're all pretty similar, but again, Mission San Jose was slightly above the rest as the only school to go over 1400 at 1450, and then the other schools ranged from 1340 to 1390. For their national merit semifinalists, the 2 key points here is that Mission San Jose is definitely well in front of the others at 64 in 2021, and that Foothill definitely lags behind a bit at only 16 in 2021. And then Amador Valley and Irvington seeing a slight decrease, where Dougherty Valley stayed the exact same at right at 40. Now for their CAASP percentage for their college-ready students, as you can see here, as we talked about in the previous slide, Dougherty Valley did have had impressive numbers for each category at almost 100% for English, 96%, and then 88% for math. And then another kind of key point here is that Foothill was the only school that had their math readiness below 70, but it was just right under 70 at 69%. Amador Valley was basically right at the same at 70%. So that's some information on their CAASP. For their AP scores, not as much to talk about here. The charts are very similar. Nearly 50% of Mission San Jose students almost scored A5, which was 49%. And then the one other standout is that Dougherty Valley had the lowest for both categories. They were the only school that had below 90% for 3 or higher at 85%. And then they did have the lowest for 5, which is 31%. Now for their number of clubs offered, Dougherty Valley definitely offers the most clubs by a significant margin, as we talked about, 150, but Mission San Jose does offer a good amount as well at 100. And then for the other 3, it is a range between about 45 to 70. Now for our last slide here, for the comparison statistics, when you look at the number of AP classes, one key point that we noticed is that all 5 of these schools actually offer more AP courses than some of the top South Bay public high schools. Lynbrook offered 17, Monte Vista offered 18, and then Saratoga offered 19. As you can see, all 5 schools here did offer at least 21, and then the most was Amador Valley and Dougherty at 25, and then Foothill slightly below it at 24. So that concludes our presentation on the top schools, public high schools in the Tri-Valley area. And so now we're going to get into some questions here in a minute. But before I get into a couple of those questions that I see in the chat, if we don't have a chance to get to your question or we're unable to give a detailed answer about it, definitely join our Bay Area Schools discussion group to receive those detailed answers just by scanning the QR code below. Easy to just join the group. You can type your question on the group, and then we'll get back to you very shortly with a detailed answer to hopefully satisfy your question. And then you can also ask the questions by checking out our website and sending your questions and getting professional help. There's the website right there, www.thethinkacademy.com. But I'm going to get into a couple questions here. Will these slides be shared with everyone at the end of the session? We will have a recording of it on YouTube that we will put on, and then we're also going to like cut up each section. So we'll have a section for each school, and then a section for the comparison statistics, and maybe also a section for just the niche and US news rankings as well, if we find that to be valuable. So we definitely will be sending, we definitely will have a recording of it. And then we also, if you want just the slides themselves from the PowerPoint, we can send those as well. You should have your email listed if you registered for the event. We'll email just everyone for it. So yeah, you can get the slides, and then you can also get our recordings if you in the group, because that's where we'll be posting the recordings, and the clips will be in our Facebook group. But we can definitely email you the physical slides. So that's a good question. Curious, if the Academy only covers high school, does it include elementary, middle? We cover all schools, elementary, middle school. We actually, our first webinar that we ever did, we talked about private schools such as Harker, Nueva Basis, and their pre-K and their elementary school program. So we definitely cover elementary and middle as well. It's just that when we had our poll in our group, there was a lot of interest for the public high schools in the South Bay and Peninsula, and then we had also a lot of interest in the high schools in the Tri-Valley area. But if there is a lot of interest in elementary and middle school, which I'm sure there is, we can definitely do future webinars for elementary and middle, not just for public, but private. Very good question. Will we share it on our Facebook group? Absolutely. It is live streaming on our Facebook right now, but we'll have a recording of the webinar as well as all of the individual clips. We'll get those out within the next couple of days. We'll have the YouTube recording up tomorrow. Is it for the also, what is the criteria for the schools included in this study? Is it mostly based on availability of info? Yes, it is availability of info. For instance, there is no way to actually kind of create, there is no way to, unless the school actually provides it for you through their school profile or other methods, such as like emailing them. If they don't have like a pie chart for their, for instance, their admission percentages for UCs or publics or CSUs or private schools or out-of-state schools, we have to use what the resources we have. So we use resources such as the UC Berkeley admission website, as well as other database like Polaris List, and as well as just feedback from parents and students to try and get all of this info. And we try to create as much as we can for this webinar to try and get as much info as possible. But if there was some info that we didn't cover that you would like to know, definitely you can ask it in the group, the Facebook group, and we can get back to you with as much detailed answer as we can. So that's kind of how we pull all of our data from databases, from school websites, and what the schools will provide us, as well as parent student feedback. Thank you. Oh, of course. Any info on school admission numbers of Dougherty Valley High? Thanks. Yes, we did in the previous slide, we did cover some of the admission rates for UC Berkeley and UCLA, as well as kind of like a breakdown for each category in that chart. Like I said, we will send you slides of all of them, of all the slides, so you can see that graph for yourself. But if you were interested in maybe like knowing like what's the exact admission rate for like a UC that we didn't cover, like Davis or Irvine, San Diego, Santa Barbara, or even like a CSU, if you want to like type the question in our group chat, we will definitely have a detailed answer with like a graph that'll show the admission rate for like any individual school that you're wondering for Dougherty Valley or any other school. Is there any info on the majors or functions for each of these schools? Um, we're not exactly sure. That is not exactly sure what that question exactly means. If you can be a little more specific in the group chat, we definitely can answer that more in depth. Um, yes, so that when I look at this, there's one more, computer science, arts, etc. We don't right now have exact like major functions for computer science or arts and psychology, just a little bit of info. I do know that Irvington, they definitely focus more on business. And then as you can see from like Dougherty Valley, they have a lot of clubs. They actually have a lot of clubs for psychology, for the arts, and then for computer science. But definitely we can look more into that. If you want to ask that question in our group chat, we'll definitely dig into more of that info more in depth, and we can answer that. But that was the one question that we didn't cover quite as much. But thank you so much for these questions. It looks like that is all of the questions for this webinar. I think I've gotten to all of them. There's about 12 or 15. But thank you so much for coming to our webinar. Hopefully all this information was helpful. And then we'll definitely be providing all of these slides to you via email. And then in our Facebook group, we'll be providing the whole recording as well as clips. And then if you have any other questions that come up afterwards, just type it into our group and we'll come back to you with a detailed answer. But yes, thank you so much for attending this webinar on the top public high schools in the Tri-Valley area. We hope to see you in our next webinar, which will be in about 2 weeks. We'll give you some more information in our group, probably on Friday. So thank you so much, and we hope you have a great night. Bye-bye.